I don't believe you've heard the tale of the Guild of Heroes. A marvelous tale, if you ask me. Would you like to hear it? Well, long before the Heroes Guild became a symbol of order, before its banners flew above Albion, there were already men and women who carried swords, bows, and wielded strange powers. People called them heroes, though the word meant something very different back then. They weren't part of any brotherhood. No council guided them. No shared code held them together. Most followed opportunity wherever it appeared, protecting the weak one day, chasing coin the next. In those days, one place drew them more than any other. Brightlodge. It was a thriving city, built on trade and ambition, the kind of city where fortunes were made. Merchants filled its markets, caravans crowded its gates, and anyone strong enough to survive the road could usually find work within its walls. Naturally, heroes followed. For a time, their presence kept order. Bandits hesitated, caravans moved with confidence, traders slept a little easier, knowing that skilled fighters watched over them. But Brightlodge was never a guild. It had no structure, no discipline, and no lasting vision for what heroes should be. Strength held things together, and strength alone rarely holds anything for long. History tells us that Brightlodge eventually fell. The details faded with time, as so many stories do, but its collapse left behind a lesson no one could ignore. Heroes could build prosperity, yet without guidance, they could just as easily destroy it. Somewhere in Albion, one man watched these events unfold and began to see the pattern. He understood that power on its own was not enough. It needed direction, it needed discipline, and above all, it needed purpose. And the idea already forming in his mind would change Albion forever. The world following Brightlodge was dangerous, not unusual, not shocking, just dangerous. Bandits controlled the roads, monsters stalked the wilds, and anyone with power, well, they answered to no one but themselves. For years, that was simply how things were. People survived where they could, and hoped trouble passed them by. But chaos has a limit. Sooner or later, someone decides it's time to change the rules. In Albion, that someone was Scythe. He had seen what power could do when it went unchecked. He had lived in that world himself, and he understood something that most people chose to ignore. Heroes were strong, but strength alone wasn't enough. Without guidance, even the bravest warrior could become a threat, not out of malice, but because no one had ever taught them restraint, obviously. So Scythe made a choice, a bold one, a risky one. He found Nostro, a bandit, a mercenary, a man shaped by survival and violence, the kind of man the world usually ignored, for good reason. But Scythe didn't see what Nostro was. He would see what Nostro would become. Because buried beneath the rough edges, there was something else. Something untrained, something dangerous. Power. And power that was tied to the bloodline of the Archon himself. One that could shape Albion, depending on who held it. Most people would have feared that, but Scythe saw an opportunity. So he stayed, and he began to guide him, not with force, but with patience. He taught Nostro how to think beyond survival, how to lead instead of simply fight the savage, how to carry responsibility for others and not just himself. And slowly something shifted. Nostro began to see the world differently, not just as a place to take from, but as a place breaking under its own weight. Roads ruled by bandits, villages left exposed, and people surviving through luck more than safety. Strength was everywhere, but direction was not. And that was the problem. Power without control wasn't freedom, it was chaos, waiting for the right moment to break everything. And so Nostro made a decision. He would build something new, a place where heroes could be trained, where strength could be shaped, and where power would serve something larger than itself. The place became the Heroes Guild. Not a fortress, not just a refuge, an idea, a concept. That heroes didn't just appear, they could be guided, shaped, and held to something greater than themselves. And for a time it worked. The heroes grew in strength. Not quickly at first, but steadily. Something like that finally found its place in the world, and its name spread across Albion. Across villages, across roads, across trade routes that once felt forgotten, and people began to trust it. When danger appeared, heroes came. Not always perfectly, not always cleanly, but they came. Bandit raids were pushed back, caravans moved with less fear, and small settlements began to grow instead of collapse. For many, it was the first time life felt stable. The guild became more than a place. It became a promise. Inside its walls, heroes trained together. Warriors, archers, will users, all under one roof. They learned control. They learned discipline. They learned what it meant to carry power without losing themselves to it. Thank God. Reputation mattered there, so did responsibility. And above everything else, so did restraint. Across Albion, something quietly began to change. People stopped expecting chaos as the default and started to expect help instead. For generations, that belief held. The guild was respected, heroes were admired, and across the world, for a brief stretch of time, it felt like it might finally stay in balance. But stability has a way of softening things. Not all at once, not loudly, just slowly, until people stop noticing the edges starting to fray. But we'll come back to that. So what was life like in the Heroes Guild? Well, it was structured, that's for sure. Carefully so. Nothing was left to chance. Days began early, with training first. Swords, archery, will control, endurance, strategy. Again and again until movement became instinct. But it wasn't just combat. They were taught history, ethics, the weight of decisions that would follow them long after they left the guild's walls. Evenings were quieter, thankfully. Study, reflection, conversation, the kind that slowly builds identity without anyone noticing it happening. And over time, something formed. Not just skill, not just discipline, a sense of belonging. The heroes ate together, trained together, lived side by side. Rivals became allies, and allies became something closer than friends. It creates bonds that run deeper than most people outside the guild would ever understand. But the guild wasn't just shaping individuals, it was controlling something too. Power. Because power left alone doesn't behave. It shifts, bends, and finds excuses. So the guild imposed structure, rules, expectations, consequences, and not to limit heroes, but to keep them from becoming something else entirely. Something dangerous. And for a long time, it worked. Generations passed through those halls, generations upon generations, and Albion came to rely on them. But even within order, change begins quietly, in small decisions, in quiet disagreements, in questions that don't get answered right away. And those questions, well, they never stay quiet forever. But for many years, the Heroes Guild stood as a symbol of order, and at its center was Nostro, the man who built it, the man who gave it purpose. But time has a way of changing even the strongest intentions. At first the changes were small, easy to miss, easy to excuse. New projects began under Nostro's direction. large ones, ambitious ones. One of them was the Witchwood Arena, and it was meant to be simple, a place where disputes could be settled openly, where conflict didn't spill into villages or roads. But something shifted. What was meant to be resolution became spectacle. Not that I was complaining. But people stopped coming for justice. They just came to watch, to be entertained. And alongside that shift came another influence. A courtesan named Magdalena. She was intelligent, charismatic, calculated, and she saw something in Nostro that others didn't. Not just power, but authority that could be shaped. At first, it wasn't obvious. I mean, influence rarely is. But over time, her presence became different. It began to guide his decisions. Subtly at first, then steadily. Ambition replaced caution. Confidence replaced restraint, and the guild began to change with him. Heroes were no longer only trained to serve, but they began to seek fame, reputation, rewards. Strength became something to display rather than control. And the guild, well, it slowly drifted. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but enough that those who remembered the old version began to notice. One of them, of course, was Scythe. He had stayed long enough to see what Nostro had become, and he did not approve. He had once believed in what they were building, but belief has its limits, and eventually he left. No speech, no confrontation, just absence. And with him gone, there was nothing left to pull Nostro back towards what he once was. And in the end, Nostro could see it. What the guild had become. What he had become. The people who once followed him were gone. Even Magdalena was gone. And in the end, he was alone. That was when the assassin came. Quiet, unseen, patient, and poison did what steel did not. Nostro understood what was happening before it was finished, and in his final hours he called for Scythe. Not as a leader, not as a founder, but as a man at the end of what he had built. Scythe came, and he did not judge him. He simply stayed, spoke of what good he had done, of what he had achieved, of what would remain even after him. And when morning came, Nostro was gone. The guild endured, but something in it had already begun to fracture. Not because it had fallen, but because it had learned that even its creator could fail. But centuries passed, and the Heroes Guild endured. The institution remained strong, and its halls were still filled with heroes. Its purpose seemed clear, but beneath the surface, disagreement was growing. For generations, the guild had favored noble causes. Heroes were expected to serve the people, to protect the weak, and to uphold a clear sense of right and wrong. That system had kept order, but not everyone believed it was fair. Two of the guild's most powerful members, Weaver and Maze, saw things differently. They believed the guild had become too rigid, too controlling, too certain of what was right. In their view, heroism was not something that could be so easily dictated by rules. It was something that had to be chosen. So they challenged the old system. They led a revolt within the guild, and their goal was not to destroy it, but to change it. But that doesn't come without costs. Thousands died for their little rebellion, and the once great guild was severely diminished. It was a radical shift, and from that point forward, heroes would be given the freedom to decide their own path. Good deeds and questionable ones would both be offered, and each hero would be responsible for the consequences of their choices. For the first time, morality within the guild was no longer guided from above. It was placed in the hands of the individual heroes. The guild survived the revolt, but its identity had changed. No longer a strict order with a single moral direction, it became a place of choice, and with choice came uncertainty. A few decades later, there was an abnormality. A child arrived at the guild, an orphan boy from the village of Oakvale. Raised within its walls, this child would one day become the hero of heroes. Through training, hardship, and loss, the young hero grew into one of the most powerful figures in Albion's history. Their journey ultimately led them to confront Jack of Blades, an ancient force whose influence had shaped events across generations. Against overwhelming odds, the hero defeated Jack of Blades and ended his reign of terror. Albion was saved, and once again the guild stood at the center of that victory. For a moment it felt as though the Age of Heroes had returned, but after the devastating losses during the guild's revolts, and the recent battle with Jack of Blades, the guild had work to be done in order to regain its former glory. And the world was about to change forever. Time continued to move forward, as it always does. Generations passed after the defeat of Jack of Blades. The great threats of the past faded into memory. For the first time in centuries, Albion entered a period of relative peace. But peace has a strange effect on institutions built for war. Without monsters to slay, or ancient evils to confront, the role of heroes began to change. Many still protected villages and upheld justice. Others, however, grew careless. Some became arrogant. A few abused their power, and the people noticed. At the same time, the world itself was transforming. Inventors and merchants began experimenting with new technologies. Machines, tools, and weapons that required no heroic bloodline to wield. Among them was a strange new device, a firearm. At first, it was expensive and unreliable. Most villagers couldn't afford one, and few believed it would replace the strength or skill of a hero. But its existence carried a dangerous idea. Power no longer belonged only to the heroes. As technology spread, so did independence. Town guards became better equipped, and citizens learned to defend themselves. Communities that once depended on wandering champions began to question whether they need them at all. And as trust weakened, resentment quietly took its place. Stories of reckless or dishonest heroes traveled faster than tales of noble ones. A single drunken mistake, a single failed rescue, a single abuse of power. Those stories lingered. The guild still stood, its towers still trained heroes, its traditions still endured. But the world around it, well, it had already begun to move on. The end did not begin with a battle. It began with anger. Across all of Albion, resentment towards heroes grew louder. Crowds gathered in town squares, pamphlets spread accusations, merchants and travelers shared stories of theft, negligence, and broken promises. Many heroes tried to calm the unrest, others prepared for violence, and the guildmaster urged for patience, believing the anger would fade. It did not. The mob turned its fury towards the guild itself. Armed with torches and newly acquired firearms, they marched on the institution that had once symbolized hope and protection. The mob breached the guild's gates. Flames spread through its halls. Bodies lay in its corridors. The institution that had guided heroes for centuries was reduced to ash. The Heroes Guild was destroyed. In the years that followed, surviving heroes scattered across Albion, hiding their identities, abandoning their powers, for if they were discovered, They were captured and executed in public arenas. The Age of Heroes had ended. And without trust, even legends can fall. I guess that's what happens when people stop believing in their heroes. Turns out swords and magic are powerful. Yes, they always were. But power was never the thing that decided who shaped Albion's story. Reputation did. What people believed about you, what they remembered, what they chose to repeat, and what they chose to forget. And that is how the guild ended its story, with belief slipping away. I suppose if there's a lesson, that's it. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed this story time. Can't wait for the next one. Catch you then. Peace.